Professor Henry Ergas, thank you very, very much for joining me here today and making the time to speak with me. You've had a distinguished career to date, and you've got an extensive honorarium, including positions with numerous universities, an economic advisor to Deloitte, and you've been a member of the chairman, a chairman of numerous advisory panels around the world. So thank you for making the time to talk with me. Professor, as an economist, you analyse and commentate on a lot of different aspects of the economy and public policy. Of particular interest to me here today are your thoughts as an economist on the Australian carbon scheme. So for those who don't already know, can you summarise what the Australian carbon scheme is, what it's designed to do, and whether or not you believe it's achieving those outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a bit of a misnomer to refer to an Australian carbon scheme in the sense that, well, we actually have in Australia a wide range of policies that one way or the other are intended to deal with aspects of climate change. So we have some policies that are simply in the form of regulations. So for instance, some aspects of building codes are intended to or claim to address risks and problems associated with climate change. We also have regulations that bear on energy supply, and so those regulations are intended to mandate growing use of renewable sources over time of electricity generation. And then finally we have a very general scheme, which is the current carbon tax future emissions trading scheme. And that scheme is a scheme whereby a charge is imposed for any activity that emits greenhouse gases with some exclusions, and those activities that are brought within the scope of the scheme have to, at this stage, pay a fixed tax per unit of greenhouse gas emitted, and then at a point in the future we'll make the transition to an emissions trading scheme whereby to emit greenhouse gases you'll have to show that you have purchased a permit that allows you to do so. And so the scheme as a whole is the sum of all of those different policies that range from a carbon tax through to direct regulation.
So why are these being introduced? This is quite a wide range of measures that we're talking about. There's obviously an overarching goal. What is the goal, and is it being achieved?
Well, the goal of the scheme in theory is to induce reduction in emissions. So its goal is abatement in the sense of, over time, achieving a reduction in both the emissions intensity of the economy and its total emissions. And it's intended to do that both through command and control type instruments, such as mandating the use of renewables for particular purposes. It's intended to do that through subsidies to, for instance, the development of renewables technology and the use of renewables technology. And it's intended to do that through these general incentives, such as the carbon tax now and the price of emissions permits in future. Is it achieving much by way of abatement? I don't think there's a great deal of evidence that it's achieving significant abatement. What it is doing is increasing the cost of emissions-intensive activities, and also providing subsidies to activities such as solar electricity generation that are low or no emissions directly, though clearly there's a fair volume of emissions built into, for instance, the equipment that's used for solar power. The theory underlying the scheme is that over time the incentives to abate will strengthen because the implied price will increase or was intended to increase, and there's an interesting question about whether it will in fact increase, and so what sort of incentive that will provide. But the theory was that the price would be rising over time. You'd be on an increasing price trajectory over time. That would provide a growing incentive for abatement, and at the same time that the cost of abating was expected to decline over time, so that it was really the combination of those two forces that would lead to significant eventual abatement. But so far, you'd have to say, to the extent to which we've had foregone emissions, for instance, from wind or solar, they're trivially small, both in absolute and relative to the resources that have been used in these schemes.
So the idea, if I can try and put it into a nutshell, is to try and make it economically attractive to emit less carbon dioxide for these relatively carbon-intensive industries.
Yes, the idea is that you will achieve abatement through this mix of instruments, some of which provide incentives, others provide direct edict. So achieve their objective by command and control rather than by incentive. And the clearest area in which that occurs is obviously mandated renewables targets, but there's also other elements of that kind, for instance, building codes that require the use of lower heat loss or heat gain in buildings, with the aim of then reducing energy intensity, with the aim in turn of reducing emissions. So you have to bear in mind, and it's important when you try to assess the costs of these policies, that this is a complex of policy instruments, not always consistent, indeed often inconsistent, and where some of the disguised costs, such as the costs of these edicts or command and control type of instruments, may be very high, but is not at all transparent.
They're not noticed by people, they're not attributed by people to reducing carbon emissions. They're seen as the cost of building or some other cost.
Yes. So, for instance, take changes in the building code. So moving from, say, we have this star rating system for housing, moving from 3 to 5-star housing requirements or whatever it might be. That will simply be experienced by buyers who bear the costs involved as an increase in the cost of purchasing a new home, but they won't see transparently that so as to save or avoid some level of emissions over the lifetime of that home, a component of that additional cost has been incurred. So they're very opaque measures, and they very often have extremely perverse consequences. So, for instance, take these environmental codes, the notion of underlying these environmental building code type requirements is to increase the energy efficiency in the broad of these new homes, whatever exactly that may mean. So you increase the cost of construction for the sake of avoiding some energy use. The effect of that, because these apply to new homes rather than existing homes, the effect of that is to make new construction less attractive relative to prolonging the life of the existing dwelling stock. And so the perverse consequence of it is that by increasing the cost of new homes, it increases the price of all homes, new or old. It produces very strong incentives to extend the life of existing homes rather than incur the higher cost of construction. And so it leads to a lower quality housing stock, whilst at the same time increasing its price. Now, very few people will directly experience that as a cost of climate policy, but it is a cost of climate policy, and in any comprehensive reckoning of those costs would certainly need to be included.
Well, speaking of opaque and somewhat confusing policy issues, in 2010 you released a report in the Australian Journal of Agriculture and Resource Economics titled "New Policies Create a New Politics: Issues of Institutional Design in Climate Change Policy." Now, in that paper, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just my very broad overview of what you were dealing with, you discussed the institutional design of some of the proposed schemes at the time, and in particular, you were looking at the final report of the Garnow Climate Change Review. You raised a number of concerns about the effectiveness and the value of climate change policies. So what are these institutional concerns, and are they still an issue now 3 years on from when you wrote that report?
Oh yes, I think they're very much of an issue, and we see that in all kinds of areas that have to do with climate change policy. So the basic notion that underpinned that article was a notion that in economics goes back a long way, but the insight came from a book that an American political scientist called Schachtschneider wrote about the US tariff. And Schachtschneider's point was a simple one, which was that when you create a new policy, that new policy area becomes the focal point for attention by interest groups, and it creates new interest alignments, some defensive, aimed at reducing the harm that those policies will do to them, others more extractive in the sense of organizing themselves to secure long-term revenues or other benefits from this new issue area. And so new policies in that sense, and this is the phrase for which he's famous, or one of the phrases for which he's famous, new policies create a new politics. And his point there, that is a fundamental point in understanding the policy process, is that often we think of policies as being the result of politics. Right. So politics exists, political mechanisms exist, that gives rise to policies. However you might describe that black box, the black box has some inputs, the wiring is the political system, and the output is policy. And instead his point was that whilst that's true, obviously, there's also a feedback loop. And that feedback loop is that as policies evolve, that reshapes politics, and then that sets the framework within which future policies are going to evolve. Now, that's exactly what's happened with climate policies. I mean, climate policies have been a huge galvanizing force for the creation of extractive interest groups. So an extreme case of that is the Renewables Lobby. Essentially what's happened there is that renewables industries and a whole range of other players who are involved with renewables in one way or the other. The renewables industry has been a strong proponent of aggressive policies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, once they've made those commitments, once they then secure the political support, get agreement that mandates the use of essentially their output, which is the renewables technologies in different forms. They then lock in investments. They lock in jobs that depend on those investments. They have shareholders, super funds, etc., who are all dependent then on the stream of income from those sunk investments. All that then creates a significant obstacle to future policy change, but it also creates a very large group and over time growing group that has an interest not merely in perpetuating the policy, but also in extending it. We see that equally when you look at research. So if you look at the academic and quasi-academic research community, in which I would include public research institutions such as CSIRO, those entities and the scientists and academics who work in them are very heavily dependent on public funding. They're heavily dependent on project and program related funding. Their activities are increasingly costly and capital intensive, for instance in terms of the research equipment and infrastructure that they require. When a new area emerges, that too becomes the focal point for the attention of that community, and it creates interest groupings within it who are then heavily invested in that area and have a significant stake in that area's growth and survival over time. You see that, for instance, for younger researchers who are increasingly under pressure, not merely to publish or perish, but also whose performance is increasingly judged on the basis of the research awards or grants that they can receive. That when an area emerges, younger researchers whose career prospects and academic standing really then depend on being able to secure the recognition that receiving this research funding entails, they become invested in that area and form an interest group that's no different from other interest groups in really having a very significant stake in that area's prosperity. So when you do that, you create what, from an economic perspective, and I'm not saying this to belittle the quality of the work that people do or the seriousness or professionalism within which they do it, but I'm saying from the perspective of an economist, these look to us like an industry, like any other, just like you have people who exploit opportunities when frozen pizza production becomes a significant activity. So you have people who exploit opportunity when climate change research becomes a significant activity. And because all of that has interacted with a dynamics in the government process and in the political process of trying to create and then strengthen public support for these initiatives, it creates formidable momentum, but also very considerable costs to try to reverse or adjust these policies over time. And so what you get is a sort of situation that we have in Australia where you'll get policies being pursued that proved to be very costly and ineffective. So take, for instance, solar panels on people's homes or water tanks in people's homes that are really ill-conceived from almost any point of view. Even if you really wanted to abate, this is just not the way you would do it. But once you've subsidized people to do this, then trying to pull back from it is politically just horrendously difficult. And so bad policy, once it's made, has this very significant element of irreversibility. And it was that dynamics that I was concerned with in the paper, that really what was happening when you looked, for instance, at the Garnaut report on climate change. The underlying message in that report was, here's an area where to achieve these objectives, we need to impose significant taxes on economic activity generally, be it directly in the form of an explicit price or indirectly through regulatory mandates and fiat. Right? But it then said, well, that will give us a flow of revenues that we can use to all of these purposes, to compensate some people, subsidize others, pay off yet other people, and so on. And so what you really had there was an exercise in constructing interest groups that would act as the basis for the perpetuation of these policies, regardless of whether their benefits in the long run exceeded their costs.
Right. Now, Henry, the Australian Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, as it was known, when it was introduced along with a compensation package for families. The idea being that that was going to cover the cost of the scheme for families. We were told that it was a tax only on the big polluters, that it wasn't a tax on everyone. It was only a tax on those companies and those economic activities that were, or business activities that were causing the most carbon dioxide emissions. Is that true? And how does that claim stack up? Are people in fact being compensated adequately? And is this a tax that is only applying to the big polluters in Australian society?
Well, obviously from an economic perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense, in that it's like any other tax on business. Right? I mean, businesses as such don't pay taxes. Taxes are paid either by consumers who fund those businesses, or by shareholders or providers of capital to those entities. The business itself, in a sense, is simply a box that receives and pays out. And so the question from an economic perspective, when you look at taxes that are imposed on business, is always, well, who's ultimately going to pay for that? And obviously in the case of the carbon tax, the long run effect of that is to increase prices, and through that increase in prices, that reduces the value of the incomes that people receive. Because if you had $1 before and you could buy something for 10 cents, you still get $1 now. It's going to cost you 12 cents or whatever it may be. So the compensation, in a way, was said to be that it would offset the price changes that would result from the imposition of the carbon tax. For instance, the increase in electricity prices, or the increase in other prices that consumers might have to face. Now, was it adequate compensation? Did it fully offset that? Well, again, in an economic sense, it's obvious that it cannot fully offset it, right? And the reason it cannot fully offset it is because, in a way, what you're doing when you impose a tax such as the carbon tax is you're shrinking the pie, right? Activity that might otherwise have occurred, economic activity that might otherwise have occurred, will not occur. There'll be less economic activity because the costs of doing things have increased. That's why you might want to compensate people at all, but it's because the costs of doing things have increased, and so you'll be doing less of those things. Right? And you can't fully offset that because you don't have another pie that you can go to, as it were, extract enough to make up that reduction in income in the long run. So even if you take the workings that were done for the carbon tax in Australia, though the statements made by the government were at times somewhat misleading, what they actually might have compensated for was the effect on the price level. Right. But what they clearly did not compensate for, and never actually claimed explicitly that they could compensate for, was the fact that the economy was going to grow less in the long run, wages were going to grow less in the long run, and so people were not going to be as well off as they would have been had you not imposed that tax. Now, that doesn't mean that imposing the tax is necessarily a bad idea. If it was going to yield really significant benefits, then it would be worth doing so. But it clearly remains the case that the compensation package did not make people whole relative to that loss of incomes in the long run.
Right. So the Australian scheme initially set its own price on carbon with the intention of switching to a market price, and specifically switching to tie in with the European emissions trading scheme, and whatever price the European scheme happened to be would become the Australian price when that switch happened. The European scheme is currently trading at or near record lows, and certainly nowhere near the levels that were projected by the Australian government when the Australian scheme was introduced. What's wrong with the European scheme? Why has the price in Europe of carbon dropped so dramatically? What does that mean, and what are the implications for the Australian scheme?
Mm-hmm. Well, when the Australian schemes were mooted, so bear in mind there's a history here, the notion that underpinned it was that over time, in the conception of the proponents of this scheme, that over time the whole world would be moving to schemes like this. And so their basic idea was that by the end of this decade, certainly all the developed economies, the advanced industrial countries, the high-income countries if you want, all of those would have emissions trading schemes of some kind in place. And as they did that, you would get a global integrated market for emissions permits, and price would be determined within this very large integrated market, which, because it would be very large, would offer lots of opportunities for trade, and also because it would be very large, it would be very liquid, and hence reasonably stable, and it would have associated with it other markets such as futures markets or derivatives markets that would provide opportunities for firms to hedge their risks or to in other ways manage their exposure to the carbon price over time. Now, what's happened in reality is that no such general movement to emissions trading schemes has occurred, or really seems likely to occur anytime soon. Sure, you get pockets of schemes in places like California or Toronto or whatever else, but these schemes are really pretty small scale. They often occur in places where there's very few emissions to begin with, or low emissions intensity to begin with, and certainly where emissions aren't rising rapidly. So the only place where you really have a major scheme in place, other than Australia and New Zealand, which has a small scheme of its own, but other than that is really the European Union. Now, what that means for the Australian scheme is that if you're going to be part of a wider market, then the only real market linkage you can have is with the EU scheme. And so that then goes to your question of, well, what is this EU scheme like, and why have prices in it been so volatile? And there it's a combination of things. It's changes in policy within the EU. The EU has had a great deal of policy instability about exactly what permits it allows, for instance, how it treats the purchase of abatement outside of the Union. But additionally, that when the scheme was established and over the course of its initial period, a lot of permits were issued to activities that were going to either substantially shrink or even close down for other reasons. For instance, very high-cost steel production in Central Europe. And the result of that is that there's an overhang of permits in the EU scheme. Now that's combined with a pretty severe recession in the EU to drive prices right down. So prices are now probably in the order of 6 to 7 Australian dollars, whereas our initial price was in the 20s. And the very poor economic outlook for Europe then means that European policymakers are naturally reluctant to do anything which might make their economic prospects even worse. So where the Australian government has come to is that faced with that situation where, sure, there are spasmodic things being done elsewhere, but they're relatively small scale in terms of trading schemes. The only big one really is the EU. The EU price is much, much lower than the Australian price. What they announced they would do is link the Australian scheme and the EU scheme. But exactly how that will work isn't yet fully known. What restrictions may or may not be imposed on simply buying permits from elsewhere relative to abatement in Australia, exactly what the mechanics of the scheme will be, all of that remains to be determined. But the result of it is that in theory in 2015-16 we should shift to some kind of linked scheme, at which point the Australian price would fall from wherever it will likely be on its own trajectory, say, $25 or $27 or whatever it might be, down to some much lower level.
So what's the impact then in terms of the forecasts that the Australian government are projecting into the future? There is still a compensation package attached to the Australian scheme. Will that still be attached after the linkage to the European scheme? Well then, is there perhaps a revenue implication to that if their potential revenues from the scheme are going to drop when they link to the European scheme?
There's two major implications to the linkage. So, I mean, the most obvious implication is that if the European price remains very low, then obviously the revenue the Australian government receives will drop pretty precipitously. I mean, effectively, what would likely happen is that the Australian government would sell permits at the European price. And those permits would then be the source of the revenue which was intended to fund the ongoing compensation payments, because those compensation payments are mainly of the form of tax cuts, and so they're locked in. Now, how big would the budgetary impact of that be? Well, it depends how far the price falls, but broadly, one way to think about it is that were this done tomorrow, then the government that is counting on, say, $8.5 billion or so in revenues, plus or minus, would, were this done tomorrow, probably face a hole of another $6 billion or so in its revenue collection. So that's a pretty significant gap, and what that means is that either the government has to cut other spending, which might be much more worthwhile in terms of its benefit-cost ratio than climate change avoidance, right? So either it has to take programs that really have benefits that exceed their costs and cut them so as to fund this program, which it's arguable whether its benefits exceed their costs, or it would have to increase other taxes. And that, of course, is distorting too, because all taxes distort economic activity and hence impose some burden on the economy in the long run. So that's the first implication. But there's also a second implication, which is no less important, which comes back to what is the theory that underpins this scheme. And the theory that underpinned this scheme was that you'd face these ever-rising prices. And because you had those ever-rising prices for carbon, then that in turn would have two effects. The first effect is that people who were thinking of making investments in emissions-intensive activities would know that they'd face this rising price, and so since they'd have to pass that forward into their own prices, that would reduce demand for their product and hence reduce their output. So they would be deterred from making those highly emissions-intensive investments. At the same time, people who might invest in technologies or in developing technologies that could avoid emissions would know that the tax was going to increase ever higher, and so they would have a return, or they could expect to gain a return on the technological progress that they pioneered, and knowing that would induce more of that investment sooner, so that would reduce the cost of abatement. So you'd get a scissors effect, as it were, where on the one hand you'd suppress demand for emissions-intensive goods and services. On the other hand, you'd increase demand for low emissions technologies and low emissions goods and services, and it'd be the combination of the two that would yield a low emissions economy in the long run. Now, all of that is premised on the notion that the carbon price will increase steadily over time. Yes. That expectations will be of that steady rise in the carbon price over time. Sure, perhaps with fluctuations from time to time, but that the underlying trajectory is clear. Yet, what we see at the moment is that we have a high price today and we're likely to have an extremely low price tomorrow. So far from creating a clear signal for investment, all that does is make it into a bit of a game of roulette, where both the incentive to abate and the incentive to develop low emissions technologies are naturally blunted. And that highlights the underlying flaws in the theory. Because the theory was that what we were doing here was emulating what happens in real-world markets. And in real-world markets, if apple trees are becoming scarcer, or more difficult to grow, or for whatever reason, they're becoming less available than they used to be, then the competition for those trees will drive up their price, or drive up the price of apples. That increase in the price of apples will induce will induce investment in trying to find ways of making apple trees grow more apples. It'll induce investment in substitutes for apples. And so over time, you'll get both a demand effect. As apples become more expensive, people will eat a bit less of them, and so that will ensure that the apple trees output is used by those people who value it most highly. And at the same time, it'll induce investment in trying to make our apple trees go further and in having reasonable substitutes for those apples. So that's what happens just almost in the course of things in real-world markets. And we've seen historically many examples of that. So for instance, when at the end of the 17th century, beginning of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, wood became scarcer because there was more wood burning activity, and there were more things that were using woods, for instance, for ships and for building factories and all kinds of other things. The world price of wood rose. That induced investment in, for instance, places like Sweden, in making better use of forestry resources. There was a great change in the way the world wood market operated, and it responded naturally to that scarcity, and sent all the right incentives for that. So that's the process we see in real world markets. But this isn't a real world market. This isn't a market like the market for wood, or the market for apples, or the market for copper, or any other market that you can think of. This is a purely artificial scarcity. This is a scarcity that is created by government diktat. Governments decide, if you emit, we tax you. If we didn't tax you, you could emit as much as you wanted. So the whole functioning of this market depends on the rules that government impose. But one thing we know about governments is that often you don't get rules, you get roulette. You get situations where the politics change, the pressures change, and so the previous constraints and directions are reversed. Now, in this case, in the Australian case, what happened was that they set the price wrong. Right. They thought the world price would be in the 20s. They were, I think, genuinely confident of that. But it's not that they set that price with respect to the kinds of processes that you see in other markets, where you have real scarcity and real trade and real inducements, real property. They set that price on the basis of a kind of as-if exercise. where they thought in terms of hypotheticals, they built models, they said, well, what do we think the price should be if we were the omniscient social planner? Right? And the omniscient social planner got it wrong. Right? They thought the world price would be there. Prices elsewhere are nowhere near that. So now they're going to, in that precipitate way that governments have, they're going to try to save the furniture one way or the other, right? Because the politics then overwhelms them. And so what will happen is we'll get some other price being set. Now, the clear signal that that will send to all market participants is that the credibility of these commitments is very low. And so you won't get the mechanism that the proponents of this scheme believe it would induce. And that mechanism was never, I think, terribly plausible to begin with. And you can see that if you think of this simple thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this one. What their theory was that the price would increase every year in real terms. And eventually you'd have prices in the hundreds of dollars. Yep. Right? And because governments would commit to price rising steadily over time, that would induce all of the effects I was talking about. You would go and you'd invest heavily in developing zero emissions technology because you'd know that at some point the price will be so high that your technology will be in the money. Yeah. Right? Now, imagine for a moment that you get to the point where a government has to decide to increase that price to $130 or $150, whatever it might be. And it looks around and it discovers that, well, science is unpredictable, right? No one owns the unexpected. And as it's turned out, no one's developed a really economically viable, zero emissions way of doing things. Right? So what does it do at that stage? Does it say, hey, I promised to do this, so I better do it? Not very likely, right? Because it would be strangling economic activity. So the likelihood is that if governments believe that those technologies haven't really emerged, or that they're not really cost effective, that they won't stick to that commitment. And because there's no real scarcity, there's nothing that will really, absent government regulation, drive the price to that level. But let's say that they have developed. Well, even if they have developed, then the incentive of governments at that point isn't to keep the price that high. To say these things already exist, so long as we pay more than their operating costs, they'll be used. Yeah. Right? So if you're thinking through that experiment, you would have to say, well, there's a very real risk that this ever-rising trajectory won't materialize. Yeah. And because you'll be doing that, the supposed underlying power of this incentive is very much blunted. And so even in theory, the ability of these schemes to yield the kinds of results that people talk about, even from a purely economic theoretic perspective, that ability is very much limited by the absence of credibility of the commitments that governments make.
Now, you were speaking earlier about risk to reward. And I want to pick up on that because risk to reward is something that people talk about at length when it comes to the climate change debate. In particular, people speak of the precautionary principle. And they say that we need to abate carbon emissions and we need to try and stop climate change simply as an insurance policy, essentially, to ensure that we don't find ourselves paying a huge price in 10, 20, 50 years' time when the climate has changed. And we end up having to pay for all of the adaptation that would have to happen. What's your understanding of that risk to reward ratio? What are the cost implications of climate change And are we really better off trying to stop it?
Well, let me say at the outset that I'm not a specialist in the, as it were, scientific aspects of the climate. I'm an economist. I'm not a physical scientist, much less a climate science specialist. So I look at these issues from an economic perspective, and of course, in economics, we think a lot about how you should deal with risk. I mean, indeed, you can think that almost everything in economics is really about risk and how society manages resources and risks associated with using resources, scarce resources. So, what can we say from that perspective? Well, this is, as you summarized it, is an argument that one hears a great deal. It's the argument that there's this risk and hence we should avoid it. Now, obviously, as a general matter, that's not usually what we do in life, right? And we get out of bed in the morning, we cross the streets, we take the bus, we fly from one place to another, take the train. We do all kinds of activities that expose us to differing risks. So what we're doing is we're always engaged in some kind of risk management, and we trade off the avoidance of risks, the limitation of risk through means other than avoidance, or mitigation in the sense of being in a position to manage the costs of a risk should that risk eventuate. And our risk management portfolios, individually and collectively, involve combinations of all of those instruments, and the question is whether we get our portfolio right, or how we design it for the kinds of risks that we face. Now, in the context of climate change policy for a country like Australia, okay, there are obviously different risks. So there's the risk that climate change is occurring, and some people believe it is, other people question that. They differ also about the extent of the change, its timing, and its likely causes and consequences. Additionally, we face, as well as that, what you could regard as, sense, physical risk. We face geopolitical risk, because if global climate change depends on the stock of greenhouse gas in the environment, then that's a problem for the world as a whole, and there's uncertainty about whether the world will actually manage to address that risk were it the case that it became convinced that that risk existed. And so the question then is, what happens when we select among policy options? How does that help us select amongst policy options? Now, from an economic point of view, there's a fairly simple decision rule. And I say it's simple because it's conceptually straightforward, though its application in practice is often anything but straightforward. And that simple decision rule, which is a pretty good approximation to efficient behavior, that simple decision rule tells you that at the margin, the benefit you expect from the incremental or last unit that you devote to avoidance should be equal to the benefit that you would get or expect to get in an actuarial sense from a unit devoted to adjustment. So if you were investing 100 in avoidance, but the marginal benefit in an actuarial sense, i.e. taking account of uncertainty, the marginal benefit of that 100 was very low, and you weren't investing much in adjustment, where the marginal benefit of being better able to cope with the risk should the risk eventuate could be quite high on that marginal unit, then you should rebalance as between avoidance and adjustment. Right? Now, my own sense of it is that what's happened in Australia is that we invest massively in avoidance, where the expected return on our investment is negative or exceedingly low. And we don't invest much at all in adjustment, which is really the capacity to cope with change should that change occur. Now, why do I think that that's the approximate relativities? Well, because we are a very small player, anything we do is going to have a very, very limited impact on the stock of emissions in the world. And it'll also have a limited impact on the willingness of others to abate. That will be largely driven by their domestic policy and political considerations. And there's a very real likelihood that we'll see exactly what we're seeing at the moment, that we use resources abating, and all that happens is that other countries, by and large, continue to emit, and we too also continue to emit. And so the likelihood of having any effect on the global environment in the long run seems extremely low. And if you had to attach a probability to having such an effect, which requires a whole chain of things to happen, the resulting probability of having that effect and that effect then having the benefit, in probability adjusted terms, that's going to be very low. So we devote lots of resources to this, but the probability adjusted benefit is vanishingly low, almost certainly negative. What about adjustment? What would adjustment involve? Well, to my mind, adjustment is what societies do all the time, and market economies do it pretty well. Not always, well, never perfectly, but at least they have some way of making it happen, because real world markets do kick in, and if environments become more inhospitable, that creates incentives for people to find ways of trying to make them more hospitable. And so they exploit those incentives, they respond to those incentives. Again, as I say, never perfectly, but tolerably well and better than most other ways that we can think of trying to do those things. So what we really want is we want to have that capacity to adapt and adjust. And that leads you to a fairly different point from where the abatement avoidance strategies go, because the abatement avoidance strategy reduces your income. It makes you poorer, right? I mean, you trade off all the things that produce emissions, you trade those off so as to avoid adding to the stock of greenhouse gases. You give them up, in a way, for the sake of achieving your abatement target. So you're foregoing income. Okay? But if you look at adjustment, the more income you have, the wealthier you are as a society, the easier it is for you to adjust. The greater the depth of savings you have that you can draw on, the greater the flexibility that you have, the wider the range of goods, the greater the range of investments in different kinds of innovation, and so on. And so, to my mind, the simplest way of abating is, of adjusting and ensuring you have a capacity to adjust, the simplest way of doing that is just to get on with the business of economic growth. And if we could do that and the rest of the world would do that, sure, there's a possibility that you can't exclude that we would incur risks, and perhaps significant risks. But it would be within our grasp, just as it has always been within our grasp, to adjust to those risks as they eventuate, both through individual action and through collective action.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time. Just before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything we haven't covered that you think would be relevant to?
No, I hope that. No, I'm fine with that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.